While getting my car washed, the owner handed me a pack of cigarettes. I quit smoking, I said, thanks, but no thanks. He looked at me and said, I found this under your seat. I froze. My car has never been borrowed by anyone. Wait, no, 2 days ago, I had a business trip, and it was my wife, Alice Smith, who drove the car. The pack of cigarette was a Marlboro, which none of my friends smoke, so it couldn't be from anyone I know. I took a cigarette out and sniffed it. It was still fresh, not stale at all, probably less than a week old. Looking at the timing. It was during the days I was away. I held the cigarette, and a chill ran through me. Could it be that during the time I was gone, a man drove my car? But I quickly scolded myself for overthinking it. What's the big deal? I'm just a little paranoid. That evening, after dinner, I jokingly asked Alice Smith, were you secretly letting a man drive my car while I was gone? She was changing clothes with her back to me, and suddenly spun around, fixing her gaze on me. I chuckled and tossed the cigarette from my pocket onto the table. The car wash owner found it. Who's the colleague? Oh, it's our manager, Henry. You've met him. I parked badly, so I asked him to park it for me. I'll return it to him tomorrow. Alice quickly shoved the cigarette into her bag, then finished changing and went downstairs to go for a run. I watched her retreating figure from the balcony, deep in thought. I had met their manager Henry, but I remember him smoking Nat Sherman cigarettes, not Marlboro. These details were things only smokers would notice. Alice, of course, wouldn't understand. Suddenly, I felt like something wasn't right. Even if she asked someone to help with the drive car, what was the big deal? But why was she lying to me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I decided to check the car's dashcam footage to get to the bottom of it. At least it would be better than overthinking it. But when I opened the dashcam's memory, all the footage was there, except for the days I was away on business. If I hadn't specifically checked, no one would have noticed the missing footage. And the gap would have been covered up within a few days. I quickly realized what had happened. She must have deliberately removed the memory card during those days. And that was when I was certain, my wife was hiding something from me. I first ruled out the possibility that Alice Smith lent the car to someone else. Her family has their own cars, so there was no need for her to use mine. Besides, if she did lend it other people, there would be no reason to hide it from me. I'm not the type to get upset over something like that. The only explanation I could think of for her removing the memory card was if she didn't want me to see who was driving or overhear their conversations. So, the most pressing task now was to figure out who this man was. I thought for a moment, since Alice had removed the memory card, it was likely that for those days, the car had mostly been driven by a man. And since her workplace was far from home, if a man had been driving my car, the first thing he'd probably do was drive Alice back home. We don't have a fixed parking spot, so it was impossible to check the cameras at a specific location or time, but every time a car enters or exits the neighborhood, the security gate keeps a record. I made up my mind. I went out and bought a pack of good cigarettes and headed straight for the property management office. Damn, I hadn't smoked in over a year. This was going to ruin everything. By the time I got there, it was already evening, and there was only one person on duty in the surveillance room, Luca. Someone I knew fairly well. That made things easier. I knocked on the door. Luca was looking at videos on his phone and hurriedly hid it when he saw me. "George, what brings you here?" he asked. I smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Caught you on your phone during work, huh?" Luca looked a bit embarrassed. Before he could speak, I handed him a cigarette. "Luca, I need a favor. A couple of days ago, I noticed a scratch on the back of my car. Looks like it got scraped by a gate arm. I'm not sure if it happened on Monday or Tuesday. So I wanted to check the surveillance footage. Think you can help?" "George, no way. If the gate hit the car, it would have crushed it, right? It doesn't sound like it happened in the neighborhood." Luca seemed uneasy. I knew he was worried I might hold him responsible. If I decided to file a claim with the property management, it would bring trouble, and showing me the footage wouldn't end well for him. "I'm not sure, that's why I want to check." "Don't worry, I've already contacted insurance. You won't be affected. The insurance company is being difficult. They want the surveillance photos. It'll just take a quick picture of something that looks like it, and it'll be fine." Luca's expression softened, and I took the opportunity to slip him $100. "Help me out. I've already spent on the back, so might as well make a little money fixing it. Why not take the chance?" Luca took the money and became much more agreeable. He didn't understand much about insurance, but he said, "Just don't tell anyone," and then turned to pull up the records for the days I wanted. That week, my car had entered the neighborhood around 6:10 p.m. each day. Luca showed me the surveillance photos from the gate cameras at that time so I could send them to the insurance company. I snapped a couple of pictures with my phone, handed Luca another cigarette, and casually said my goodbyes. As soon as I stepped out of the surveillance room, my face went pale. In the photos, it was clearly a man driving my car, with Alice in the passenger seat. They got home about 20 minutes later than usual, meaning during that 20-minute window, either Alice was picking him up, or he was picking her up. Due to the camera angle, I couldn't see the man's face clearly, so Luca thought it was me. But the man's hand was unmistakably resting on Alice's leg, far over the center console. My mind went blank. It hit me like a ton of bricks. My wife Alice, she was definitely cheating. With the time they entered the neighborhood, I could have quickly checked the surveillance footage from downstairs. But I didn't do that. First, it's about face. The last thing I wanted was for Luca to know that the man in the footage wasn't me. I didn't want the whole neighborhood finding out that my wife was cheating. Second, there was something about the man's clothes that seemed vaguely familiar. I couldn't quite place it. I spent nearly half a pack of cigarettes downstairs, still unsure what to make of it. What exactly was going on between them? Or, to put it more bluntly, how far had it gone? After all, we were married no matter how things ended, whether we stayed together or not. How we carried ourselves would make all the difference. I looked up at the balcony, wondering how much longer I could live in this house. Then, suddenly, something clicked. I spotted Alice's workout clothes hanging on the balcony. They were reversible. If I turned them inside out, the color and style would match what the man had been wearing in the footage. Could it be? Was this the man who ran with her every day? I quickly grabbed my phone and pulled up Alice's social media. Thankfully, she didn't post much. I remembered a picture she had shared a while back of her regular running group. Scrolling through, I found it. There they were. In the photo, there were 5 people, 3 men and 2 women. Alice and another woman were squatting in the front, while the 3 men were behind. The first man on the left, directly behind Alice, looked almost identical to the man I had seen in the footage driving my car. He wasn't tall, but his physique was fit and muscular, someone who obviously worked out regularly. More importantly, he had a youthful face. The kind of face that women like these days. The photo was taken about a year and a half ago, just before we got married. If this was him, could it be? I didn't want to think about it anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to hold off confronting Alice for now. I needed to prepare myself before I made any moves. I'd gather more information and then act. I pretended nothing had happened and even asked Alice for sex that night. She said she was too tired and asked for it another day. I laughed in my heart. A few days later, I figured she'd forgotten all about the cigarette box incident. It was the weekend, so I decided to take her to the mall. We went to a sports store, and I pretended to be interested in a few pairs of shoes. I even asked the sales assistant if there were any discounts if I bought in bulk, like, say, 50 pairs. The sales assistant jumped on it and eagerly spoke to the manager, offering me several discounted styles. She also gave me her contact info. I made a note to reach out after deciding. Alice overheard and asked, "Why are you buying so many shoes?" The boss had a sudden idea for a company marathon as a team-building thing, I said casually. She seemed to buy it, so I asked, "By the way, the company's looking for someone who runs regularly to be our coach, someone who can join once a week, flexible hours, and the pay is pretty good. You run all the time. Do you know anyone?" Alice's interest piqued. "Why, can't I do it?" "You?" I looked at her and pretended to be embarrassed. "It's better to have a man. There are many men in the company, you know. And with the relationship between you and me, you will suffer if you don't take the money. But I will feel embarrassed if you take the money." She thought for a moment. "That's true. Do you run with any guys?" I pressed. She seemed to think, then said, "There's one. Let me ask him." The next day, she came to me after her run and asked, "Do you still want that trainer for the company?" "Of course, but I need to speak with him first. There are a few things I'd like to discuss and make sure the pay is fair." She agreed and said we could meet him the next day. I knew she was taking the bait. If I hadn't said anything, she might have gotten suspicious. But now, she would be leading me right to him. The next day, Alice took me to their usual running spot. There, waiting for us, was a man. As soon as I saw him, I knew it was the same guy I had seen in the photo and, more importantly, the same man who had driven my car to pick Alice up. The man greeted me casually, we exchanged pleasantries, and he added me on social media. He introduced himself as Derek, a PE teacher at a local elementary school. I smiled and said, "Great. With your experience, they'll definitely try to get you a higher rate." Alice stood by, clearly proud. Which made my stomach churn. Derek, pleased, pulled out a cigarette and offered me one. I froze. It was a Marlboro, just like the one I had found in my car. Then I secretly estimated in my mind that it would take about 20 minutes from the elementary school to Alice's workplace. It all lined up perfectly. I ran with them for a while, quietly observing their interactions. Derek seemed eager to show off in front of me, alternating between sprinting and stopping to stretch dramatically. Alice, on the other hand, deliberately kept her distance, staying silently behind me without engaging in much conversation. They were putting on a good show, but their lack of life experience made it obvious. If you're introducing someone to a business opportunity, why act like you barely know them? People who truly have nothing to hide wouldn't be this distant. And during our breaks, I caught Derek pretending to stretch while sneaking glances at Alice, looks that didn't escape me. That kind of gaze, every man knows it. It was filled with smugness, mockery, and an air of superiority. Like he believed he had already won and was just playing along for fun. I couldn't see how Alice responded, but a surge of anger rose in me. Afraid I'd lose my temper, I made an excuse about feeling tired and left early. I wasn't going to let that man walk away thinking he'd gotten the better of me. He'd soon learn who the real fool was. As for Alice, I still held on to a sliver of hope. Maybe she hadn't crossed the final line. After all, we were married. If she had even a shred of conscience left. I didn't want to completely destroy her. So it wasn't time to confront them yet. Instead of going home, I went to see my friend, Ryan. Ryan came from money, never held a serious job, and spent his days messing around with his crew, dabbling in whatever caught his interest. But he was loyal, well-connected, and knew all the right people. I showed him Derek's profile and told him what had been going on. Ryan, never one to hold back, burst out, "What the hell? This guy's got a death wish or something? Want me to bring a couple of guys and teach him a lesson?" I told him to hold off for now. I didn't want to tip my hand until I knew the full picture. But once I had the facts, Derek would pay double. Ryan nodded. "I'll find out everything about him. When the time comes, we'll settle the score." Before I left, Ryan handed me a USB drive. "My buddy just whipped this up, it can clone data from a phone. Didn't think I'd ever need it, but I guess it was made for you." I forced a bitter smile. Seems like all my luck in this marriage was reserved for catching my wife cheating. When I got home, Alice was already back. She asked where I'd been. I told her I'd been with Ryan. She knew him well, he was that rich, carefree friend of mine. I added that had recently invested in a new project and made a lot of money, so I went to see if there was an opportunity to get involved. "How'd it go? Think you can invest?" Her eyes lit up at the mention of money. "Shouldn't be a problem," I said casually. "With our friendship," he said, "they'll open up another round of investments next month and will let me know the details." "My husband's amazing," Alice gushed, planting a kiss on my cheek. Maybe she thought it was a good day and wanted to celebrate. She took off her jacket right in front of me, walking seductively toward the bathroom, hinting that we could be intimate later. I felt sick to my stomach. I told her I had some work to do, needed to go over Ryan's project materials, and suggested she go to bed without me. Then I locked myself in the study. While Alice was showering, I connected her phone to my laptop and launched the program Ryan had given me. Within 10 minutes, I had a full copy of her phone's data. I put everything back in place, returned to the study, and took a deep breath. Even though I'd mentally prepared myself, facing the raw, undeniable truth still made my heart race. I searched her contacts for Derek's name. His profile picture popped up, and my hands trembled slightly as I clicked on it. But there were only a few messages. What? I scrolled through them, less than 20 messages in total, all about running. The earliest was from over a year ago, and the most recent one was from 2 months back. Had I been wrong? Were they really just friends? I stared at the screen, confused and shaken. I quickly realized something was off. Their act was convincing, but it felt too much like the kind of situation where, when you're invited to meet someone, there's a certain natural pre-meeting communication that happens. If they hadn't spoken for 2 months, then either she had deleted the chat history, or she was using another account to stay in touch. I thought about it carefully. If she had deleted the messages, that wouldn't make much sense. I didn't know her phone password. Nor did I make a habit of checking her phone. And if someone were to delete their chats, they'd likely clear everything, not just leave a few seemingly irrelevant ones behind as a red herring. If she were smart enough to leave those, then she'd also know to keep some of the recent contact intact. So, it was almost certain she had another account to communicate with Derek. And that made things even worse. I had to find that account. Then, an idea struck me. Just before we got married, Alice had changed her phone number. Afterward, she registered all her accounts with the new number, saying she wouldn't use the old one anymore, and I hadn't kept it. I cursed myself for not keeping track of it, because now it wasn't easy to trace an old number. Plus, back then, phones weren't necessarily registered under real names, so I might not even be able to track it. As I was thinking, my eyes caught an old iPad on the desk. It flashed, probably to alert me about an app update. This iPad was Alice's, and it had become practically obsolete, now only serving as a clock. But the Apple ID on it was still tied to her old email, an email I had never contacted before. I immediately checked the email. It hadn't been updated in a long time, so she likely wasn't using it anymore. But what caught my attention was a linked phone number. Yes, it was the old number, the one Alice used before she changed it. I added that number on a social platform, and sure enough, an avatar popped up. One look, and my heart sank. No wonder when I added Derek's contact. I had noticed Alice's expression flicker for a moment. She probably thought I'd never figure out that number, so she didn't bother hiding it. Even though I hadn't added her as a friend, I could still see the latest 10 posts on her social media. I clicked on the first one, and it shattered any remaining hope I had. It was a picture of 2 feet, one large, one small, sticking out from under the covers. The time on the post was during the days I'd been away on a business trip. The caption read, "Only with you, is it truly warm?" And I immediately recognized the background. It was from the bed in our guest room. I nearly vomited. My blood rushed to my head, and I had to fight with everything in me to stop myself from rushing over and slapping her across the face. I'd been out there, working hard to provide for us, and they were at home, having an affair. I scrolled through the rest of her posts, and they were filled with declarations of love, affection, and hints of intimacy. They'd been sleeping together for a while now, without a doubt. Gradually, my anger morphed into a kind of calm acceptance. To be honest, I had already mentally prepared myself for the worst. It was just harder to digest seeing it with my own eyes. I lit a cigarette in the study to steady my nerves. A few minutes later, Alice walked in. "Honey, weren't you quitting smoking?" she asked, surprised. At that moment, I even had to admire my own acting skills. Ryan's project really is lucrative, but the investment is huge. I need to do the math, so I'm having a smoke to clear my head. Her expression shifted from surprise to delight. "Well, take care of your health. Okay? Don't worry. You go ahead and sleep. I'll finish up here." As I watched her turn to leave, I already made up my mind. The next afternoon, I went to see Ryan again. He told me he had some leads. "Bro, I don't know if I should say this, but Alice has been cheating on you for a long time." I lit a cigarette. Ryan looked at me in disbelief. "Your mental strength is something else. Are you sure your brain hasn't been damaged by all this?" I showed him Alice's anonymous second account. "I found it last night. I've given up hope, and I've accepted it. Now I'm just thinking about how to make them both pay." "Man, that's just despicable," Ryan said, scrolling through the phone. He handed it back to me. "So, your wife and her lover? They've been at it for over 5 years." Ryan explained that Derek was Alice's high school classmate. They probably started dating in college and had broken up and gotten back together multiple times. After graduation, they lived together for a while and even talked about marriage. But both of their families were poor. Derek had graduated from a second-rate sports university and couldn't find a decent job. He was still a part-time teacher at the same school. Alice's family didn't approve of Derek because he couldn't afford a house, while Derek's family didn't like Alice because she wasn't good at taking care of the home and couldn't help out. Around that time, Derek had started working at a gym, where he had flirted with a client, and Alice, angry, accepted a match from her family and came to me. Ryan continued, later, after you two got married. Alice got drunk at a company event and called Derek, telling him she still couldn't forget him. They got back together secretly and have been at it ever since. Ryan said this was all information from one of his business partners, who happened to be Derek's former classmate. The news about Derek and Alice had spread around their old circle of friends. It all made sense now. No wonder Alice didn't invite any of her classmates to the wedding, and I hadn't seen her keep in touch with them. At this point, I was completely calm. But I was worried Ryan's questions might tip them off. Ryan assured me that he had used the excuse that a friend of his had a crush on Derek and went to inquire about his character. Derek's classmate's final evaluation of him was that he spent all his brains on playing with women. Just then, Derek messaged me, asking when we could go running again. I knew he was indirectly asking me if there would be any follow-up to this matter. I realized his classmate's evaluation of him had been off. Not only was Derek obsessed with women, but he was also greedy for money. Since he liked those two things so much, I decided to give him a gift he'd never forget. I asked Ryan, do you have a friend who's really good at pretending to be innocent? A woman who could do that? Ryan paused, then quickly understood. You're a genius. He soon brought in a woman named Amy, around 30, with a standard internet celebrity look, perfectly made up, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to play her cards. Amy was known for receiving so many flowers every holiday that her trunk couldn't hold them all, but she never went beyond the line. Just made money selling houses and insurance. I explained the situation to Amy, telling her to maintain her innocent persona and wait before taking any action. I promised to cover all her expenses and that she'd get the final, big payoff when everything was done. With that, I started setting up my trap for Derek. I told him that my boss was away, so we couldn't go running for now, and I sounded a bit disappointed. Derek replied with a simple "oh." Then I added, by the way, during the big publicity event at my company, a client, she's a strong, independent woman, was interested in finding a running partner. She asked me to check if you were available. Derek immediately perked up. Sure, bro. So I arranged the time and location for him, reminding him that the client was a high-maintenance woman, so he needed to be punctual. He responded eagerly, thanks, bro. I won't let you down. That evening, Ryan drove Amy in his Rolls-Royce to the meeting spot. Derek was already waiting there. I didn't want to be involved too much, so I stayed out of sight, letting them handle it themselves. Later, Ryan told me that when Amy got out of the car, she immediately turned heads. Not only was she beautiful, but her tight sportswear also accentuated her curves. She became the center of attention right away. But Amy was cold and aloof toward everyone, except when she saw Derek. She warmed up to him as if she was genuinely taken by him. Derek's ego must have been on cloud 9 at that point. After all, he probably hadn't felt this validated in his life. Amy threw a few flirtatious gestures his way, and he was completely hooked. In the end, when Amy offered Derek payment for his time, he flat out refused. The two of them even made plans for another session. Meanwhile, Alice looked like a complete joke. Of course, Derek wouldn't mention Amy to her. Without me being there, he felt even more at ease. I let Amy take her time, but I was already preparing the next part of my plan. A couple of days later, after I came home, I brought up the investment with Alice, telling her about Ryan's side of the deal. The total investment was $1.2 million, and it was expected to break even in about a year, with at least $1 million in profits by the second year. Alice was thrilled, linking her arm through mine and pressing herself close to me in excitement. I told her, though, that there was a problem. I don't have $1.2 million at the moment. I've scraped together $200,000 and sent it over to Ryan, but the remaining $1 million, he'll need to figure out how to handle. She grew anxious. She couldn't bear the thought of losing this opportunity and asked how I planned to manage it. I said, I'm thinking of mortgaging the house. That should get me $1.5 million in a loan. The moment she heard this, her face changed. The house had always been a sore point for her. She felt that if I used it as collateral, it was like I was preparing to leave her. The house was under my name alone. It was my property before we got married, and she had asked a few times to have her name added to the deed. But since there was still a $300,000 loan on the house, we couldn't do it just yet. I reassured her, don't worry. I'll mortgage the house in your name. I'll sign the contract with Ryan under your name too. That way, both the property and the investment returns will be in your hands. You don't have to worry about me running off. She hesitated for a moment, then laughed. "I'm not worried. It's just that I'm a bit scared about the mortgage." I teased, "What's there to be scared of? If anyone should be scared, it's me. If you run off with someone, you'll be left with nothing." She laughed even brighter, and I could see she was getting flirty, almost ready to pounce. I quickly stopped her. "Let's get back to business," I said, putting on a thoughtful expression. "There's actually another problem." "What's wrong?" "Well, the house still has some debt on it. The mortgage can't be processed until that's cleared. The bank won't approve a second mortgage otherwise." Alice's face darkened as she seemed to ponder the situation. I added, "It's not much, just 300,000. The problem is, I don't have that kind of cash right now. Do you have a way to make it work for a bit? Once the loan comes through, I can pay it back." She kept her gaze fixed on me, as if trying to gauge my intentions. I still had one more card to play. I smiled slightly and said, "Once the loan is paid off, we can transfer the deed into your name. What do you think? That way, we'll both be in this together. If we make money, neither of us can run away." I acted like I was doing it to bind her to me, and she immediately warmed up to the idea. "All right, I'll borrow it from my parents." She was finally hooked. When I married her, I actually gave her 250,000. Her parents, the Smiths, said they were saving it for us, but in fact, they had long regarded it as their daughter's private money. "Even if I can't get this money back, I will never let her get away with it." I pretended to hesitate. "Isn't it a bit much? They might think I'm just after their money." She assured me, "Don't worry, I'll explain. After all, it's for the family. They'll support it." I nodded. "All right, I'll take them out for a nice meal, and once we get the money, I'll pay them 10,000 in interest." Alice kissed me a few times in her joy, and I thought to myself, "You'll be the one crying soon enough." A few days later, I invited Mr. and Mrs. Smith to a fancy local restaurant. During dinner, Mr. Smith's mood kept shifting, dark and uncertain. Finally, when I offered him a drink, he couldn't hold back anymore. "George, is this friend of yours trustworthy?" I had been prepared for this moment. I pulled out a few of Ryan's investment projects and showed them to him. These were well-known, profitable ventures that anyone would recognize. They couldn't find a single flaw in the documents. "Mr. Smith, as you know, our family has always been in the middle class. While I'm still young, I want to take a shot at making something of myself, and give Alice a taste of the rich wife life. This opportunity is perfect, especially since we can add her name to the house title. It's a win-win, don't you think?" Mr. Smith seemed about to say something, but I quickly cut him off. "If you really think there's too much risk, we can leave Alice's name off the title for now. I'll shoulder the risk myself. What do you think?" The moment I finished, Mrs. Smith shot a disapproving look at her husband. "You're being too harsh, dear." "Of course. We'll face everything together as a couple." She quickly diverted the conversation. "When the time comes, you can transfer the money directly to Alice. I'll go with her to the bank to handle everything. Once it's settled, we'll add her name." Mr. Smith finally relented. All right. We're family, no need for formalities." We talked some more, and I casually asked Alice in front of her parents, "By the way, about that guy Derek, I had to postpone the company project, but I introduced him to a beautiful female boss. Did you talk to him about it?" I noticed both of Mr. and Mrs. Smith's faces change when they heard Derek's name. Alice seemed awkward and quickly said, "No, I didn't." I headed to the door to pay the bill, but at the entrance, I heard Mrs. Smith's voice drop as she spoke to Alice. "Alice, are you still in touch with that guy named Derek?" Alice sounded a little displeased. I couldn't tell if she was upset because Mrs. Smith asked, or if it was about Derek talking to the female boss and not telling her. Mr. Smith chimed in, "Alice, I know you don't like George, but you're married now. What do you expect? And now that we've invested money, you should at least show some care." Alice snapped back impatiently, "I know." I stood by the door, nearly laughing. "No, you don't like me? Really? And as for you've invested money? All of it's my money, yet they act like they're the ones who sacrificed. Anyway, Amy's already wrapped Derek around her finger. I just need to wait for the right moment to reel him in." While Amy was spending time with Derek, I arranged for her to have plenty of business calls, mostly involving buying and selling real estate. The market was down. But for those with the right connections, there was still money to be made. Amy always seemed to find ridiculously cheap properties, and within no time, she'd flip them for a quick profit. A few phone calls later, the difference was tens of thousands of dollars. Amy, already in the business of flipping properties, talked about it as if it were second nature, rattling off details about deals and properties that left Derek completely confused. But she made sure Derek saw the huge sums of money being transferred back and forth. Sometimes she'd even have him help her with small tasks like collecting money or transferring payments. Derek did some quick math, and realized the profits Amy was making from a few calls were more than he'd ever earned in years. It didn't take long before Derek couldn't resist asking Amy what kind of business she was in. Amy played it down, saying it was just pocket money, and that her friends had connections to get first dibs on debt properties and distressed sales at incredibly low prices, about $3,040 below market value. As long as you weren't greedy and added a small markup, you could sell them quickly. Derek's eyes practically lit up, and he begged Amy to let him in on it. Amy acted like she was doing him a favor, explaining the risks involved. She told him it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows and that he should be careful about how much money he had to invest. Derek, of course, didn't want to seem weak, and assured her that his family had some savings ready to go. He urged Amy to get him involved. A few days later, Amy took Derek to a luxurious property sales office in another city. The place was packed with potential buyers, and Derek, having never bought property before, was shocked at the crowds. Amy casually mentioned that this particular project was offering insider discounts, and only people with connections could get in on it. She added that the project was about to be acquired by a big developer, and once it was, the price per square foot would jump by $2,000. They were escorted into a VIP room, and a property consultant started showing Amy some units. Amy picked two, paying the $600,000 down payment for each, but because there was a limit of 1 unit per person. She had one of the properties registered under Derek's name. Derek was ecstatic, thinking Amy's decision to use his name was a sign of her special trust in him. To make matters even more exciting for Derek, one of the properties Amy registered under his name was sold less than a week later. The price had been marked up, and Derek made an $80,000 profit from the deal. And the kicker? He even handled the transaction himself. Derek was completely hooked. He begged Amy to help him get another property. And Amy promised to take him to close another deal if he had the funds ready within 3 days. The trap was set, and now it was just a matter of waiting for Derek to fall into it. At the same time, I told Alice that Ryan's project would be delayed for a month. To save on interest, we decided to hold off on the loan for a little while. I told her to hold on to the money Smith's family had given us for now and let it earn a little interest. The money Alice had was originally intended for Derek. I then made my exit, telling Alice that I had a business trip coming up. The rest, as they say, was in Derek's hands. But this time, there would be an extra audience for their performance. I had secretly installed 2 cameras in my house. After all, it couldn't be illegal to set up cameras in my own home, could it? Sure enough, the moment I left, Derek walked right through the door that evening. As soon as Derek entered the room, it was clear that they hadn't seen each other in a while. Immediately, they were all over each other, fueled by pent-up desire. But just as things were heating up, Alice suddenly pulled away from Derek and asked, "Do you have another woman outside?" I almost laughed out loud behind the screen. How audacious. A woman who's cheating on her husband asking her lover if he has someone else? She switched identities so effortlessly. Derek, caught between his burning desire and a gnawing guilt, quickly tried to explain himself. He claimed he was only putting up with Amy for their future. In his version of events, Amy was just some wealthy older woman who was after his good looks. But he hadn't crossed any lines with her. He was only putting up with her in the name of making money for their future. He told Alice that he had gone to great lengths to convince Amy to bring him in on a deal. In fact, he had borrowed $300,000, but he still needed another $300,000 to close the deal and asked if Alice could help him out. Alice wasn't a fool, though, and she didn't jump to lend him the money right away. So, Derek began his performance. He reminisced about their past, talked about their bright future, and even squeezed out a few tears for extra effect. I had to admit, his acting skills were impressive. Finally, Derek pulled out his transaction records, showing Alice how Amy had transferred large sums of money to him, and Alice was taken aback by the proof. She began to waver, mentioning that she had exactly $300,000 sitting idle, but she needed it in a month. She asked if Derek could pay her back by then. Derek, desperate, quickly assured her that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that they couldn't afford to miss. His promises sounded like thunderclaps, so much so that he almost seemed ready to swear an oath. In the end, Alice transferred the money to Derek, and the two of them proceeded to the celebration stage of their evening. I sat in my hotel room, watching the entire show unfold on my computer screen, feeling both satisfied and relieved. As for what would happen next, I wasn't concerned. The next day, Amy took Derek to the sales office again. After Derek paid and signed the contract, it was finally time for everything to fall into place. A few days later, when I returned home, Alice seemed particularly attentive. I couldn't tell if it was because she was feeling uneasy about the $300,000 she had lent or something else. I told her that there was bad news: Ryan's project would be delayed again. But to make it up to her, I suggested we pay off the mortgage and add her name to the property title to avoid any future issues. The look on Alice's face was priceless. She hesitated, saying there was no rush and that it could wait. She had a 7-day term deposit maturing soon, and she wanted to wait until then. Meanwhile, Amy let me know that Derek was starting to pressure her to sell the property, even if it meant taking a small loss to get his feet wet with the deal. I transferred $20,000 to Amy, telling her it was about time to wrap things up. Unexpectedly, Amy returned the money, saying she had earned a $200,000 commission from the deal and was only taking what she was owed. She thanked me for introducing her to the client. Amy delayed Derek for a few more days, and as the 7 days drew near, Alice began urging Derek to act faster. Derek started to feel the pressure. He asked Amy to help him close the deal quickly, and she told him that if he was in a rush, he should meet her at a hotel to discuss things in detail. Derek, thinking he was in for some lucky double delight, eagerly booked a room and waited for Amy. She showed up wearing a sexy camisole, and Derek immediately lost all composure. Amy told him that things were tight for her at the moment and that she'd need more time to close the deal. However, if Derek really felt bad for her, he could make a request. Derek, eager and already imagining what was to come, rushed to the bathroom to freshen up. Before this, I had already sent Alice an anonymous text with Derek's room number. She called and texted him, but her attempts were ignored, and she ended up storming off to the hotel in a fit of rage. Ryan and I were hiding in the lobby, watching the situation unfold. Amy timed it perfectly, letting Alice walk in just as Derek, wrapped in a towel, was sitting on the bed. The atmosphere was absolutely electric. Alice, already angry and upset, was thrown into a fit of rage when she saw Amy. In comparison, Alice suddenly felt like an ugly duckling and took out all her frustration on Derek. Derek, whose plans had been completely ruined, was just as furious. After spending time with Amy, he saw Alice for what she truly was: a mess. With no way to explain himself, he let the conversation fall apart. Amy, who had far more experience than them, walked away easily, leaving Derek and Alice to clash in the room. That night, Alice told me she had something to handle at her parents' house and wouldn't be coming back. I rushed over to Mr. Smith's house, eager to see her look of defeat. When I saw the bruise on her face, I couldn't hold back my excitement and immediately asked what happened. Seeing how concerned I was, Alice finally broke down and said she'd had a fall but didn't want me to worry, so she hadn't returned home. I had to stop myself from laughing, offering her comfort for a long while. Just as I was about to take her home, I casually said, "Don't be upset, honey. The $300,000 will come through in 7 days, then we can make a lot of money, and you can finally be happy." The expression on her face was as if she'd just swallowed something foul. Mr. Smith asked what had happened, and I quickly came up with an explanation. But Mr. Smith immediately sensed something was off and pulled her into the room to question her. Mrs. Smith told me to leave, saying Alice wasn't feeling well and they'd stay with her. As I was leaving, I heard a loud slap from inside the room. The next evening, Alice came back, and no amount of thick makeup could hide the swelling on her face. She looked drained, but still tried to force a smile, being unusually attentive, far more so than usual. I asked her what happened. Had she fought with her family? The money was almost due. 2. When should we go to the bank? Each of my questions felt like a sharp knife to her heart, but she could only swallow her pain, scrambling to come up with excuses. Days passed, and I could see her growing more and more depressed. It was time to give her a final push. I told her the project with Ryan was settled and that she needed to have the money ready in the next few days so we could apply for the loan and not let things drag on. Seeing that she couldn't keep up the act anymore, Alice finally admitted that she had lent the money to a friend and couldn't get it back. I pretended to be shocked and asked her who the friend was. She hesitated, then reluctantly gave me Derek's name. I told her not to worry, that I would accompany her to his school the next day to demand an explanation. That night, I could hear her tossing and turning in bed. She must have known that tomorrow would be the turning point in her life. The next day, we stormed into Derek's school and demanded he repay the money. At first, he pretended to be cooperative, asking for a few more days. But I turned to Alice and asked, "What do you think?" Alice was caught in a difficult spot, neither here nor there. Her face turned red, and it seemed like she was recalling her final break with Derek. Finally, she screamed, "No. You'll either give us an explanation today, or I'll make sure everyone in your school knows about this." Derek, pushed into a corner, finally admitted that the house he bought was unsellable. The developer had run off, and the building was left unfinished. All the money he had invested was gone. But it didn't end there. The property cost more than just the $600,000. It had actually cost $2 million, and now, on top of our loan, he was stuck with a $1.4 million mortgage, and he was drowning in debt. He was at his breaking point, and if we kept pushing him, he warned, it would end with both sides being destroyed. Alice was completely stunned. She grabbed his shirt collar and shook him desperately. Derek, too, finally snapped. He started scolding me. He cursed the boss I introduced to him, saying he was a liar. I responded, "I only introduced you to her for running, not for anything else. If you think she's a scammer, why don't you go report her to the police?" Derek opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. I knew he'd already gone to Amy long before this. Amy had apparently told him straight out that she was just an intermediary, and that all the transactions were with the developer. The money went directly to them, and she had no part in it. She told him to go ahead and report her if he felt cheated. Derek, in a fit of anger, accused her of fraud. Amy just laughed and said, "The people at the sales office are hired by the developer, the contract was signed voluntarily by you. And if you check the records, you'll see I never once told you to buy the house." I heard that Derek actually went to the police, but when they asked for evidence, all he had were the sweet words he'd said to Amy. She hadn't said anything concrete, and since she hadn't taken a penny of the money, she was simply a legitimate sales agent. Any issues could only be directed at the developer who had run off with the funds. Derek, remembering all this misery, finally turned his anger toward me. "It's all your fault. All your fault. It's you who ruined everything. And if I don't pay you back, what will you do about it? Come and arrest me, then." The more he shouted, the more worked up he became. Alice, realizing the situation was out of control, couldn't stop him in time. "George," Derek shouted at me, "don't get too smug. Your wife has already been with me, I've slept with her in every corner of your house. I've had my fun with her, and now I'm handing her back to you." It was like a blessing from the heavens. He just saved me the trouble. I silently applauded him in my mind. Then I looked at Alice. Her eyes were bloodshot with rage. She kept telling me not to listen to Derek's words, and before I knew it, the two of them were at each other, struggling and fighting. I feigned shock, turned around, and left. Alice came rushing out after me, but I slammed the car door and stepped on the gas, leaving the scene with a smooth getaway. No one would ever know what really happened, just how I planned it all along. I was at Ryan's place. The two of us lazily smoking as our phones buzzed non-stop with messages and calls, until eventually, everything went quiet as the power cut and the phones shut down. By the time I turned my phone back on in the evening, it froze for a solid 2 minutes before any response, and I couldn't be bothered to check the messages that popped up. That's when Alice's father called me. I picked up. He immediately said, "Don't listen to that bastard, he's just lying to you." I told him I'd spoken to Alice's old classmates. And it was clear that she and Derek had a history. Smith went silent for a moment, then exploded. "Alice says she wants to commit suicide. If my daughter dies, I swear I won't let you get away with it." I had to bite my lip to stop myself from laughing. This was my last bit of restraint. But I pulled up the dash cam footage and checked the memory. Everything was there, except for the days when I was away on business. After a long silence, Smith finally said, "Everyone makes mistakes. You're a bigger person, forgive her. Well, make sure she treats you better from now on. Heck. If you want, you also cheated once, and I'll tell her that'll settle things." I hung up immediately. With parents like that, it's no wonder she turned out the way she did. My phone kept buzzing throughout the night, but eventually, it quieted down. The next morning, Alice sent me a message, "Let's get a divorce." I replied, "Okay." She sent me the divorce agreement, but when I read it, her demands were ridiculous: half of the house, half of the 300,000 debt to her father, and the car entirely for me as compensation. This woman, even now, was still dreaming. I refused and insisted we go to court. In the courtroom, I presented the evidence of her affair with Derek. The court ruled in my favor. The house and car were mine. As for the money she owed her father, that was between them, and had nothing to do with me. Alice finally realized the entire situation had been a trap I set for her. Her family unleashed a stream of the nastiest insults at me, until the judge had enough and warned them that if they didn't stop disrupting the court, they'd be detained. When I walked out of the courtroom, Ryan and Amy were waiting outside. It wasn't that I was with Amy now, but Shed handled things so beautifully, I couldn't help but want to thank her with a meal. Later, I asked Amy, "Aren't you worried Derek might retaliate?" Amy sneered and said, "Even if I gave him a knife, he wouldn't dare to stab me." After all, Derek had spent $2 million on a house, and who knows? Maybe one day, it'd actually be completed and delivered. I pulled out a cigarette and handed one to Ryan. He asked, "Since when did you start smoking Marlboro?" I smiled. "It's a good day today. A bit of a commemoration. After today, I don't think he'll be smoking Marlboro anymore."